The desert night was quiet, and yet beneath that silence, history was in motion. Far above the Sahel, the whirry blades of the Akinci drone cut through the air, invisible to those below, carrying with it not just military power, but the weight of an entire continent's struggle. On the ground, 3 terrorist bases sat hidden in the sands, their presence haunting villages, destroying lives, and dimming the hope of countless families. For years, people in the Sahel had lived with fear carved into their daily routines. The fear of Boko Haram and its allies had become like an endless shadow, stretching across generations, stealing away the laughter of children and the peace of elders. But this night was different. This night was about to tell a new story. The Akinci, sleek, advanced, and armed with precision, was not just a machine in the sky. Under the command of Traoré, it became a symbol of something far greater: African resolve. A $4 million strike might sound like numbers on a page to distant observers, but for those who had lost family, who had seen schools burned, who had buried neighbors in silence, it was not numbers. It was justice. It was dignity returning to a land that had long been suffocated by terror. The strike began with pinpoint accuracy. The first target was a camp that had been a base of planning and recruitment. For years, militants had lured vulnerable youth into their grip from that very ground, twisting dreams into nightmares. In seconds, the base was gone, swallowed by fire and smoke, leaving only silence in its place. The second strike followed swiftly, a camp known for stockpiling weapons and smuggling them across borders, a place where violence was born and distributed like poison into communities. That, too, was erased. Then came the third, the most fortified of the sites, guarded and feared. With one final, precise impact, it collapsed into ruin. 3 bases, 3 strongholds of terror, wiped out instantly in a coordinated strike that sent shockwaves across the region. For the people of the Sahel, news traveled faster than the wind. Radios crackled with urgency, villages erupted in murmurs, and soon the whisper grew into a roar. People who had lived with their backs bent under, the weight of fear suddenly stood taller. Mothers who had once hushed their children indoors let them play outside with brighter smiles. Elders gathered under trees not to speak of loss, but to recall the courage of those leading their nations into a new chapter. The strike was more than an operation, it was a message. A message that the era of helplessness was fading and that dawn of self-defense, led by Africans themselves, was rising. Traoré's name was carried on the lips of many, not as just a leader, but as a symbol of resilience. He had already been a figure of strength, a young man with a background as a soldier, a bodybuilder who carried both physical and moral weight. But now, through decisive action, he had become a figure of belief. The belief that African nations could rise without waiting for permission, without bowing to outside powers, and without surrendering to those who thrived on chaos. The drone in the sky had become a reflection of pride on the ground. 2 outsiders. The elimination of 3 terrorist bases may appear as another headline, another military statistic, another strike in a long list of battles. But to those who lived within reach of those bases, it was like the lifting of a curse. Imagine walking every day, knowing that men with guns could appear at any moment, knowing that a simple trip to fetch water might end in horror. Then imagine waking up to hear that those very men, those bases of cruelty, were gone overnight. That shift cannot be measured in numbers. It can only be felt in the beating hearts of the people. There is something profoundly human in this moment. Behind every explosion was not only technology, but also the raw ache of families who had prayed for safety. Behind every decision made. In that operation were memories of villages burned, fields destroyed, and futures stolen. And with every base destroyed, there was a silent promise whispered back to those who had been lost. We will not allow your suffering to continue unchallenged. Across the Sahel, hope began to flicker in places where only despair had lived. The young. Men and women who had been questioning whether there was any point in resisting terror saw proof that change was possible. Farmers returned to their fields with lighter steps. Teachers reopened classrooms with stronger voices. Even in cities far from the strike zone, there was a ripple of relief and pride. A recognition that this was not just about 3 camps, but about reclaiming the dignity of an entire people. The strike also carried a quiet defiance, not only against the terrorists, but also against the narrative that Africans could not defend their own lands without heavy-handed foreign intervention. It was a reminder that strength lies within, that leadership like Traoré could harness modern technology while staying rooted in the soul of his nation. The Akinci drone was foreign-built, yes, but the decision, the planning, the courage that was African, and that distinction mattered. In the days that followed, many wondered what the next step would be. Would Boko Haram regroup? Would another figure try to rise in Bakura's place? Perhaps. But what mattered most was the shift in perception. The aura of invincibility that once surrounded such groups had been shattered. No longer untouchable, no longer mythical, they were exposed for what they truly were, vulnerable and weak when confronted with unity and resolve. For the ordinary person sitting in a dusty village hut or walking along a crowded market road, the strike was not just distant news, it was personal. It meant their children might grow up in a safer world. It meant their voices, long drowned out by gunfire, were beginning to echo again. It meant that somewhere, high above in the quiet desert night, a drone carried not only missiles, but also the prayers of millions. Finally answered. Traoré's decision to unleash the Akinci drone in a strike worth $4 million was more than just a military maneuver. It was a statement, a loud and undeniable declaration that Africa was no longer bound to depend on foreign powers for its defense, its survival, and its pride. For too long, African nations had been treated as clients rather than equals, forced to wait for outside aid whenever they faced threats from extremist groups or destabilizing forces. But this moment, this strike, symbolized a turning of the tide. It showed that Africa could design, adapt, and wield the kind of sophisticated technology that until recently seemed like the exclusive privilege of others. The Akinci drone, soaring high above the Sahel skies, carried more than missiles. It carried a message of self-reliance. Every second it stayed airborne was a reminder that African hands were now guiding Africa's destiny. No longer would the people of Burkina Faso, or its neighbors, feel that they had no choice but to plead for international intervention. Instead, they could look to their own leaders, their own ingenuity, and their own courage to protect them from those who wished to tear their lands apart. What made this strike so powerful was not just its efficiency, but what it symbolized. For years, terror groups like Boko Haram and their affiliates thrived on the perception that African armies were powerless, under-equipped, and disorganized. They exploited that perception, spreading fear, convincing villagers and townspeople that they were untouchable. But when Traoré gave the green light for that drone strike, and when those terrorist bases crumbled into dust within moments, it shattered that illusion. Suddenly the narrative had changed. The hunter had become the hunted, and the people could see that Africa had its own sharp teeth. This wasn't just about firepower, it was about dignity. People often underestimate the psychological impact of technology in warfare, especially in places where ordinary families have spent years under the shadow of violence. The sound of a drone overhead was no longer a foreign aircraft from distant powers, but something owned and operated by Africans. On African soil, for African defense. That sound was transformed into reassurance, into hope. It was proof that their governments could act swiftly and effectively. That their leaders were not merely figureheads, but protectors willing to wield every tool necessary to safeguard their citizens. In villages across Burkina Faso and the wider Sahel, stories of the strike spread quickly. Parents told their children that the skies now belonged to them. Youths who once considered joining rebel groups because they felt their governments were weak began to see another path, one built on resilience and self-determination. For many, it felt like a new chapter in history, one where Africa was no longer merely reacting to threats, but proactively shaping its own security. There was something deeply emotional about the symbolism, too. For decades, the narrative around African militaries was one of dependence. Foreign bases dotted the continent. Foreign soldiers patrolled its deserts. And foreign advisors often dictated strategies. But this moment, this decision to strike with home-operated technology was different. It showed that Africa was slowly unshackling itself from that dependency and proving to its own people, and to the world that it could stand tall on its own. Traoré himself became a symbol of this new self-reliance. As a young, strong leader, he embodied the spirit of a continent rising from the weight of its history. His choice to invest in advanced technology and to use it decisively against threats demonstrated vision and courage. He wasn't waiting for permission or assistance from anyone else. He acted with conviction, and that conviction resonated deeply with people who had grown tired of seeing their leaders bow to external powers. The financial cost of the extract $4 million was significant, but too many it felt like money well spent, because the real cost of inaction had been measured for years and lives lost, in communities destroyed and in generations traumatized. Compared to that, the strike felt priceless. It was a reminder that Africa was ready to put its resources into defending its people first, not into lining the pockets of outsiders. And perhaps the most powerful part of this story is the sense of pride it ignited. Pride is not a trivial thing. It fuels resilience, it strengthens unity, and it drives people to believe in a better future. When citizens feel that their leaders are capable, when they see evidence of that capability in action, it restores trust in institutions. It rebuilds the bond between governments and their people. And that bond is something no extremist group can easily break. So when the Akinci drone roared across the skies, it wasn't just carrying missiles. It was carrying the hopes of millions. It was carrying the message that Africa's tomorrow would not be written by outsiders, but by its own sons and daughters. It was carrying the spirit of self-reliance, of courage, and of a continent finally realizing that its greatest strength was within itself all along. The destruction of 3 terrorist bases was not just another military operation. It was a thunderclap. Across the Sahel, a roar that declared Africa would no longer bow to fear. For years, extremist groups carved out safe havens in remote regions, building networks of chaos and violence. They thrived on the idea that no one could touch them, that their strongholds were beyond the reach of African armies. But in that moment, as those bases crumbled into smoke and dust, the illusion of their invincibility was shattered forever. It was a message that could not be ignored. Africa is strong, Africa is determined, and Africa will fight for its future too. Understand the weight of this victory. You have to feel the years of pain that came before it. Communities torn apart, families forced to flee, children growing up knowing nothing but the sound of gunfire and the fear of sudden attacks. Terrorists used those bases to plan ambushes, to launch raids on villages, and to terrorize people who simply wanted to live in peace. Each base destroyed was not just a pile of concrete and weapons taken out of plate, was a source of pain silenced. A chapter of violence brought to a close. For ordinary people on the ground, news of those strikes spread like wildfire. Imagine a farmer who once feared stepping onto his own land because it was too close to an insurgent base. Imagine mothers who spent nights awake, clutching their children, worried that gunmen might break into their homes at any moment. For them, hearing that those very bases had been reduced to rubble was more than just military news. It was liberation. It was like breathing deeply for the first time after years of suffocating under fear. This moment also struck at the heart of the terrorists' power, their image. Extremist groups thrive not just on weapons, but on the perception that they are unstoppable, that they can strike whenever they wish and retreat back to their so-called safe zones. The destruction of 3 of their bases ripped that mask away. Suddenly, they were not untouchable. Suddenly, they were vulnerable. And when a movement built on fear loses its aura of power, it begins to crumble from within. Recruits start to question their choices. Supporters begin to doubt. Communities once intimidated find the courage to resist. Africa's determination shone brightest in this moment. For years, critics doubted whether African nations could rise above the shadows of dependence, whether they could defend their people without leaning entirely on foreign armies? But here was the answer. This was proof, carved into the sand and smoke of the Sahel, that Africa could protect its own. It wasn't about showing off weapons or flexing for the world. It was about reclaiming dignity, about proving to every citizen that their lives mattered, that their governments would no longer sit back and wait for someone else to defend them. There is something deeply human in the pride that moments like these inspire. Soldiers who carried out the mission didn't just destroy enemy positions. They carried the weight of entire communities on their shoulders. They knew what it meant for the people back home. They knew that every successful strike meant children could sleep easier, farmers could return to their fields, and entire villages could start rebuilding without the shadow of constant fear. That kind of victory goes beyond strategy, touches the soul of a nation. And for young Africans, seeing this kind of strength changes everything. Many who grew up under the shadow of terrorism believed their governments were powerless, that no one could stand up to the extremists who controlled so much of their land. But watching those 3 bases go down in flames planted a seed of belief. It told them that Africa was not weak, that their leaders had the courage to fight, and that the future could be different. It gave them hope that tomorrow didn't have to look like yesterday. The destruction of those bases was also a message to the world. For too long, outside powers dictated the narrative of Africa, painting it as helpless, dependent, incapable of solving its own crises. But this operation told a different story, one that cannot be erased. It showed that Africa is not waiting for permission, nor is it waiting for salvation from others. Africa is standing up with its own hands, with its own resolve, and with a determination that grows stronger every day. Yes, battle against extremism is far from over, but this victory was a turning point. It was a line in the sand that said the days of impunity are over. Terrorists may still lurk in the shadows, but they can no longer believe their sanctuaries are safe. And for every African man, woman, and child who has carried the burden of this struggle for so long, that realization means more than words can capture. In that moment, as 3 terrorist bases were reduced to ruins, Africa's strength wasn't just demonstrated, it was felt in the hearts of its people. It was a strength rooted in determination, in resilience, and in the unshakable belief that no matter how long the struggle, Africa will not be broken. It will rise, it will fight, and it will protect its own. The strike boosted national pride and inspired hope across Burkina Faso and the wider Sahel, not just because it eliminated terrorist strongholds, but because it symbolized something far deeper. For years, the people of the Sahel have lived under the shadow of insurgency, violence, and foreign interference. Families have been torn apart, villages uprooted, and futures stolen. Hope, at times, felt like a fragile candle in the middle of a storm. But when the news broke that Traoré's forces had used an advanced drone to completely obliterate 3 terrorist bases in one precise strike, something shifted in the hearts of the people. It was more than military success. It was a moment that breathed life back into pride, dignity, and the belief that Africa can chart its own path without bowing to external powers in Burkina Faso's streets. You could almost feel the energy change. People spoke with a new kind of confidence. Children listened wide-eyed as elders explained how this victory belonged to them, to their soil, to their people. It wasn't a victory outsourced or borrowed from a distant ally. This was Africa using African leadership, African decision-making, and African vision to protect its own people. That sense of ownership is what turned a drone strike into a symbol of hope. Because for decades, the narrative has often been painted that Africa cannot stand without foreign hands guiding it. But here was proof to the contrary, in the most dramatic way possible. National pride is not built overnight. It comes from scars, from surviving countless storms, from enduring poverty, exploitation, and manipulation by outsiders. Burkina Faso has seen its share of suffering, but it has also shown the world resilience. Captain Ibrahim Traoré himself, a young man once known for his muscular frame as a bodybuilder, and now celebrated as a symbol of African sovereignty, became the face of this turning point. The strike was as much about sending a message to the enemies of the people as it was about reminding Burkina Citizens that they have the power to fight back and reclaim their future. And when people believe in themselves, when they believe in their leaders, when they believe that the future can be brighter than the past, that is when true national pride is born. Across the Sahel, the ripples spread quickly. In Niger, Mali, Chad, and beyond, citizens watched closely. They too have faced the same enemies, the same fears, and the same doubts. And suddenly, this single act reminded them that the Sahel is not weak. It is not a land to be pitied or seen only through the lens of struggle. It is a region full of courage, resilience, and now a growing mastery of modern tools of defense. This victory inspired people beyond borders because it carried with it the promise that if one nation could rise, others could follow. In villages that had long feared terrorist attacks, conversations began to shift. Parents dared to dream that their children might one day walk freely without the looming threat of violence. Farmers, who once tilled their land with one eye looking over their shoulder, began to feel a spark of confidence that perhaps stability could return. Even in the cities, the chatter was different. No longer only about despair or hardship, but about possibility, pride, and ownership of their future. Hope is a powerful force. It is invisible, but it changes everything. It fuels determination, it strengthens communities, it pushes people to rebuild, and it unites them in ways that weapons alone never could. The strike did not just demolish terrorist bases, it demolished a mindset of helplessness. It gave people a reason to believe that their sacrifices have not been in vain, that the bloodshed has meaning, and that the tide is finally turning in their favor. For years, foreign powers have presented themselves as the only saviors capable of handling the region's security. But the people of the Sahel have grown weary of that narrative. They wanted proof that they themselves could rise, that their leaders could take the fight into their own hands. This strike delivered that proof, in undeniable form. And the pride that came with it was not just about one battle. It was about reclaiming dignity, reclaiming ownership of their narrative, and proving that the Sahel is capable of writing its own story. In moments like this, history bends. The sight of a drone carrying out a precision strike became more than military machinery. It became a symbol of progress, of modernity, of a region that refuses to be left behind. It said to every citizen watching that Africa's future will not be dictated solely by outside powers. It will be shaped by the determination, creativity, and willpower of its own people. The pride that swept through Burkina Faso and the wider Sahel was not blind patriotism. It was rooted in real struggle, in years of endurance, and in the collective memory of loss. But it was also rooted in the understanding that finally the winds are shifting. The sacrifices of soldiers, the courage of leaders, the resilience of ordinary families, all of it suddenly felt connected to something greater, something that truly matters. The airstrike was a victory on the battlefield, but it was also a victory in the hearts and minds of the people. It reminded them that they are not just survivors of hardship, but active shapers of their destiny. It rekindled a pride that had been buried under years of pain, and it inspired a hope that maybe, just maybe, the Sahel's tomorrow could shine brighter than its yesterday. If you felt the power of this story and believe Africa's voice deserves to be heard, then don't just scroll away. Hit that like button to show your support, drop your thoughts in the comments so your voice becomes part of this movement, and subscribe right now so you never miss the next story that shapes our world. Your support doesn't just grow this channel, it keeps these untold stories alive.